The wind did not merely blow, it hunted. It tore through the gaps in the grand timber mansions of the elite, stripping away the thin, gilded illusion of their superiority. The year was 1888. The atmosphere had violently collapsed into what modern meteorology would call a cyclonic bomb, dragging the temperature down to a staggering, lethal 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Nature had come to collect its debts, and it was demanding payment in warmth, in pride, and in survival. In the sprawling, ostentatious estate of Alistair Croft, a man who firmly believed that his vast wealth could bribe the seasons, panic had finally taken root. Croft was the town's wealthiest merchant, a man who measured his worth by the towering heights of his above-ground warehouses and the sheer volume of his inventory. To protect his fragile, expensive cash crops and his sprawling manor from the encroaching White Death, he had spared no expense. He was burning money to fight a god. In a single month, Croft had spent $350, a fortune that could buy acres of land, feeding mountains of black, choking coal into the roaring iron bellies of imported industrial boilers. Beside him, pacing nervously as the frost crept up the window panes, was Julian Arkwright, a man of formal academies and rigid, lifeless equations. Arkwright was an engineer of the New Age, a man who had proudly declared to the town that cast iron, steam, and sheer capital would bend the chaotic forces of nature to the will of modern industry. He had designed the heating systems. He had guaranteed their success. But nature, in its infinite and terrible majesty, does not negotiate with ledgers, and it does not respect the diplomas of arrogant men. The cast iron pipes, exposed to the brutal, freezing atmospheric pressure of the surface world, began to shriek. The metal groaned, contracting violently under the sudden plunge in temperature. The condensation within the steam valves froze before it could even drip, creating deadly blockages. Suddenly, with a sound like a cannon shot, the glass panes of Croft's massive, expensive above-ground conservatories shattered under the immense weight of the accumulating ice. The howling blizzard rushed in. In a matter of minutes, the elite of the town were forced to watch in helpless, shivering horror as their fortunes, their imported goods, and their sheer, unadulterated hubris froze solid before their very eyes. Their gold could not generate heat. Their arrogance could not stop the wind. Yet, less than a mile away, deep beneath the howling, tearing surface of the earth, there was no wind. There was no panic. There was only a profound, ancient, and absolute silence. Here, in a space that Alistair Croft and Julian Arkwright had mercilessly mocked in the town square as a pitiful dirt hole, 16-year-old Mora sat quietly on a hand-carved wooden stool. She was not shivering. She did not even wear gloves. In her hands, she held a worn needle, calmly mending a torn wool sweater under the soft, diffused light filtering from above. The air around her was a perfectly stable, unyielding 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a warm, heavy, comforting embrace. There was no roaring fire in this space. There was no choking black smoke of coal, no desperate, midnight shoveling of expensive fuel. There was only the gentle, invisible exhalation of the earth itself. Surrounding Mora was a vibrant, impossible oasis of life. While the world above was a frozen graveyard, her underground walls were lined with thriving, deep green winter kale, crisp root vegetables, and fragrant medicinal herbs. The smell of damp, living soil and rosemary filled the air, a stark contrast to the sharp, sulphurous stench of failing coal boilers above. In the corner, resting on a bed elevated away from the cold sink of the floor, Mora's chronically ill mother slept peacefully. For the first time in months, her breathing was deep, rhythmic, and free of the agonizing cough that the damp surface chills usually provoked. Her two younger brothers played quietly with wooden blocks on the earthen floor, their cheeks flush with the gentle warmth of the room. Mora looked up at the angled glass roof above her head, watching the furious white blur of the blizzard burying the world outside. She felt no fear. She felt only the quiet, solemn vindication of a truth she had known all along. This entire sanctuary, this impenetrable fortress of life and warmth, had cost the teenage girl exactly $9.60. While the town's wealthiest men burned hundreds of dollars a month trying to aggressively fight the winter, Mora had spent less than $10 on salvaged, discarded glass panes, a handful of rusted iron hinges, and a tin of linseed oil to seal some reclaimed timber. That was the entirety of her expenditure. $9.60, combined with the sweat of her brow and the ancient understanding of the Earth's thermal mass. She had not tried to fight nature. She had humbly asked it for shelter. And the Earth, recognizing her humility, had wrapped its massive geothermal arms around her family, providing a completely passive, infinite source of heat while the arrogant elite froze in their mansions. How did this happen? How did a 16-year-old girl, an impoverished orphan burdened with the weight of her family's survival, manage to outwit the most educated, wealthy, and powerful men of the territory? How did a simple excavation in the dirt, a project that drew the cruel laughter and technical mockery of the town's leading engineer, become the ultimate mechanism of survival during the deadliest winter of the century? And how, when the storm finally broke, did this worthless dirt hole turn into an empire of passive income, forcing the very men who humiliated her to arrive at her doorstep, begging to pay for her knowledge? The answer lies in the physics of the earth, the blindness of modern arrogance, and the unstoppable force of a desperate heart protecting its blood. But before we descend into the soil and uncover the lost mechanics of this brilliant ancient engineering, I ask you to pause. If you value the silent wisdom of the past, the knowledge that the modern profit-driven world tries so desperately to erase and make you forget, leave your mark here. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and share this story with those who still understand that true wealth is not found in fighting nature, but in aligning with it. Tell me in the comments below, from which city, state, or country are you listening to this broadcast? Let us see how far the roots of this resistance have spread across the world. Now, let us return to the autumn before the Great Freeze, to the day a desperate girl picked up a shovel, and the elite made the greatest mistake of their lives. The autumn that preceded the Great White Death of 1888 did not arrive with a gentle cascade of golden leaves. It arrived like a warning, a bitter, biting exhalation from the north that stripped the trees bare overnight and froze the morning dew into sharp, brittle needles of frost. For the wealthy men of the town, this was merely a signal to order their servants to stoke the parlor fires and draw the heavy velvet curtains. But for 16-year-old Mora, standing on the edge of a rocky, barren plot of land inherited from a father buried too soon, that northern wind was the breath of the executioner. Her reality was a terrifying equation of time and temperature. Inside the drafty, rotting timber shack behind her, her mother's hacking cough echoed with hollow, agonizing regularity. The damp cold of the surface world was already settling into her mother's fragile lungs. Her two younger brothers, scarcely 6 and 8 years old, huddled beneath a single, moth-eaten woolen blanket, their lips carrying the faint, bluish tint of chronic chill. The family's meager harvest, a few bushels of late-season turnips, carrots, and medicinal roots, was piled in the corner. If those roots froze, they would rot. If they rotted, the family would starve before February. Mora held in her pocket the absolute entirety of her family's wealth, $9.60. In the town below, Alistair Croft, the merchant king, had already monopolized the winter supply chains. He had bought up the coal yards and the timber mills, artificially inflating the prices to line his velvet pockets. A single ton of low-grade sulfurous coal, barely enough to keep a small stove burning for a few weeks, cost nearly $20. The brutal mathematics of poverty dictated that Mora could not play the game of the rich. If she spent her $9 on a fraction of coal, it would burn away into useless ash by December, leaving them to freeze in the darkest, coldest depths of January. The elite had designed a system where survival was a subscription paid in gold, a system where the poor were merely fuel for their economic engines. Mora realized, with the profound, solitary clarity that only desperation can forge, that she could not fight the winter on the surface. To survive, she had to abandon the arrogant, above-ground world of men. She had to return to the earth. And so, as the first hard freezes locked the topsoil into a rigid crust, the 16-year-old girl picked up a heavy, rusted iron spade. While the town prepared their chimneys and polished their cast-iron radiators, Mora began to dig a massive, rectangular trench in the frozen mud. It was grueling, agonizing labor. The earth fought her at every inch. The cold bit into her exposed knuckles until they bled, the mud freezing into her cracked fingernails. Her muscles screamed in protest, burning with the exhaustion of moving hundreds of pounds of dense, rocky soil, one shovelful at a time. But every time her arms threatened to give out, she heard her mother's cough rattling through the thin walls of the shack. The sound was a whip. It drove the spade back into the dirt. She was not digging a hole. She was carving a fortress out of the planet itself. She dug deeper, past the topsoil, past the frost line, sinking 4, then 5, then 6 feet into the belly of the earth. It was on the 7th day of this relentless excavation that the polished, lacquered carriage of Alistair Croft crested the hill, its iron-rimmed wheels crushing the frozen weeds. The carriage stopped. The door swung open, and out stepped Croft, swathed in an absurdly thick coat of imported Russian mink. Beside him was Julian Arkwright, the town's chief engineer, holding a leather-bound notebook and an air of unbearable, academic superiority. They had come to inspect a nearby property line, but the sight of the impoverished, dirt-streaked teenage girl standing chest-deep in a massive rectangular pit was too amusing a spectacle for them to ignore. "Good heavens, child," Croft sneered, his breath pluming in the freezing air, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who has never known a day of hunger. "Has the grief finally broken your mind? Are you digging a mass grave for your family, or simply preparing to bury your pride?" Mora did not stop. She drove the spade into the clay, the scrape of iron against rock echoing loudly in the crisp air. She did not look at him. Arkwright, the engineer, stepped closer to the edge of the pit, looking down at her with a mixture of pity and intense, scientific condescension. He adjusted his spectacles, shaking his head at what he perceived to be absolute, primitive ignorance. "You are wasting your caloric output, girl," Arkwright declared, his voice carrying the loud, booming authority of a university lecture hall. "Look at the dimensions of this excavation. I assume, in some misguided peasant folklore, you believe you can live down there? Let me educate you on the principles of basic thermodynamics, since your father clearly failed to do so." Arkwright pointed a gloved finger into the trench. "You are creating a cold sink. Cold air is denser than warm air. It possesses greater mass per unit of volume. Therefore, it settles. By digging a hole, you are simply creating a basin for the freezing atmospheric air to pool and stagnate. Furthermore, dirt has zero combustible value. It generates no British thermal units. Without an active, high-yield thermal engine, like the coal-fired boilers I have designed for Mr. Croft's estates, the ambient temperature of this soil will inevitably equalize with the freezing surface temperature. You are building an icebox. You will freeze your mother to death before Christmas." Croft let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Listen to the man, girl. He has a degree from London. He knows how the world works. You cannot cheat the winter with a shovel and a prayer. Nature must be conquered with industry, and industry requires capital. Capital which, looking at your ragged dress, you entirely lack." Croft leaned over the edge, dropping his voice into a mocking whisper. "If you are truly desperate, my factories are always hiring sweepers. The pay is pennies, but you can sleep near the boiler exhaust pipes. It's dirty, and the coal dust will ruin your lungs, but it is warmer than whatever this pathetic mud hole is supposed to be." Mora stopped digging. She leaned on the handle of her spade, her breathing heavy, her chest rising and falling beneath her thin shawl. She looked up from the depths of the earth, her dark eyes locking onto the wealthy merchant and the arrogant engineer. She saw their expensive coats, their polished leather boots, and their absolute, terrifying detachment from the natural world. Arkwright knew equations, but he knew nothing of the Earth's memory. He understood the violence of burning coal, but he was completely deaf to the silent, steady heartbeat of the planet's core. He believed heat only came from destruction. "The frost line, Mr. Arkwright," Mora said softly, her voice steady and echoing slightly against the earthen walls of her trench. "The cold only reaches so deep. Below that, the earth remembers the summer." Arkwright blinked, insulted that a dirt-covered teenager had dared to speak a technical term back to him. He scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Peasant superstition, a myth for the uneducated. You cannot insulate against -20 degrees with wet mud, you foolish child." "We will see," Mora replied, turning her back to them and driving her spade into the soil once more. "Keep your coal, Mr. Croft. The earth does not charge me by the ton." Infuriated by her quiet defiance, Croft slammed his walking stick against the frozen ground. "Let her freeze, Julian. When the blizzard comes and that mud hole turns into a tomb, we will see who understands the world better. Let the dirt have her." They stormed back to their carriage, laughing loudly as they rode away, retreating to their mansions of glass, iron, and fire. They left Mora alone in the silence of the encroaching winter. They believed they had left a fool to die in the cold. But they had no idea that while they were building brittle monuments to human arrogance in the sky, Mora was engineering a masterpiece of passive thermal dynamics in the dark. The battle line was drawn not with swords, but with shovels and thermometers. And the winter, the great equalizer, was about to arrive to judge them both. The modern world measures intelligence by how loudly a machine can roar, how much black smoke it can vomit into the sky, and how much capital it can burn in a single day. But the ancients, those who survived the brutal ice ages without a single coin or cast iron boiler, measured wisdom by how deeply one could listen to the silence of the earth. As Mora stood waist-deep in the freezing mud, her hands blistered and her back aching, she did not rely on the frantic, panicked engineering of Julian Arkwright. Instead, she closed her eyes and recalled the quiet, ancestral memory passed down from her grandmother, a woman of the high, unforgiving mountains. Her grandmother had spoken of the Wallapini, the place of warmth. The old ones understood a fundamental truth that the wealthy elite of 1888 had entirely forgotten in their hubris. The earth is not a tomb to be feared. It is a thick, insulating blanket, a mother waiting to hold her children. The frost line, that invisible boundary in the soil, was the key. Arkwright believed the cold penetrated infinitely downward, but Mora knew the physics of the planet. During the brutal summer months, the Earth absorbs vast amounts of solar radiation. Because soil is incredibly dense, it takes months for that heat to dissipate. By the time the surface is locked in a frozen, -30-degree nightmare, the Earth just 6 feet below the surface retains a steady, unyielding geothermal constant of roughly 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It is an infinite, passive battery of thermal energy running beneath the feet of every freezing, arrogant man on the surface. Mora did not need to create heat from nothing, burning expensive, toxic coal. She only needed to access the heat that was already there. With her excavation complete, a rectangular pit facing dead south, she began the precise, low-tech engineering that would soon humble the wealthiest men in the territory. This was where her $9.60 were deployed, a sum so pitiful it would not have bought a single lump of coal from Alistair Croft's monopolized yards. She walked to the abandoned timber mill on the edge of town, scavenging through the debris. For $5, she purchased an array of discarded, mismatched glass window panes, some cracked, some cloudy, but all functional. For $3.10, she bought reclaimed, weather-beaten timber beams to frame the roof. The remaining $1.50 went toward a handful of rusted iron hinges and a tin of heavy linseed oil. She spent hours meticulously rubbing the oil into the old wood, waterproofing it against the coming snowmelt, sealing every crack with a paste of wet clay and dry straw. She constructed an angled roof over the pit. Here, the physics of passive solar gain came into play. Mora did not lay the glass flat. She calculated the low trajectory of the winter sun, angling the glass roof at precisely 39 degrees to the south. This angle allowed the weak, slanted winter rays to penetrate the glass directly, minimizing reflection. When the sunlight entered the underground chamber, it passed through the glass as shortwave radiation. The moment those rays struck the dense, dark earthen walls of the pit, the energy was absorbed and transformed into long-wave thermal radiation. Heat. The glass roof, acting as a one-way valve, trapped this long-wave radiation inside. But Mora was not finished. She remembered Arkwright's mocking lecture about cold sinks and heavy air. The engineer was absolutely correct in his fluid dynamics. Cold air is denser and heavier than warm air, and it will always pool at the lowest point. Arkwright believed this would be Mora's death sentence. He assumed she would sleep on the floor of the pit. Instead, Mora used his own physics against him. At the very center of her underground sanctuary, she dug a secondary, narrow trench, 3 feet deeper than the main floor. This was her engineered cold sink. As the ambient air cooled at night, the heavy freezing air flowed off the elevated planting beds and living platforms, pouring down into the deep trench like invisible water draining into a gutter. Meanwhile, the warm air, heated by the geothermal mass of the walls, naturally rose, circulating gently around her mother's elevated bed and the fragile roots of their harvest. It was a perfectly balanced, passive convection loop, powered entirely by gravity and the Earth's natural thermodynamics. 0 moving parts, 0 coal, $0 in maintenance. By late November, the underground haven was complete. Inside, it was a miracle of life. The thick earthen walls, acting as massive thermal batteries, soaked up the sun's heat during the short daylight hours and slowly radiated it back into the room throughout the freezing, pitch-black nights. The temperature hovered stably at 55 degrees. Her winter kale sprouted vibrant and green. The turnips and carrots rested safely in the warm, slightly humid soil. Her mother, breathing the clean, earth-filtered air, found her strength slowly returning, far away from the damp, lung-crushing drafts of the surface shack. Yet, less than a mile away, in the sprawling, smoke-choked estates of the elite, the mockery continued. Alistair Croft sat in his cavernous study, enveloped in the oppressive, sulphurous heat of a roaring iron fireplace. He swirled a glass of expensive imported brandy, looking over his ledgers with a grimace. The winter was proving colder than anticipated. His heating costs had skyrocketed to an agonizing $350 for the month. But Croft simply dipped his fountain pen in ink and raised the price of grain and textiles for the town. If he was going to burn money, the poor would bear the cost. Julian Arkwright sat across from him, wiping soot from his spectacles. The walls of the manor vibrated with the violent, mechanical shuddering of the basement boilers. "I drove past the pauper's plot today," Arkwright chuckled, taking a sip of brandy. "The girl has finished her mud tomb. She actually put scrap glass over it. It looks like a discarded lantern buried in the dirt." Croft laughed heavily, the sound echoing off the high, drafty ceilings. "Has she frozen to death yet? Or has the soil collapsed and buried her?" "Give it a week," Arkwright replied, his voice brimming with absolute, mathematical certainty. "The ambient temperature is dropping to 0 tonight. Glass has a terrible R-value for insulation. The moment the sun sets, that subterranean cavity will experience rapid thermal hemorrhaging. The cold sink will fill, the frost will penetrate the walls, and the ambient temperature inside that hole will equalize with the outside air. It is basic thermodynamics, Alistair. You cannot build a fire out of dirt. Without a continuous, active energy source, like our beautiful coal-fed cast iron beasts down below, she is effectively sleeping in a morgue." "Such a tragedy," Croft said, his tone entirely devoid of empathy. "But a necessary lesson for the lower classes. They must learn that survival in the modern age requires industry, obedience, and capital. You cannot just dig a hole and hide from the world's progress." They clinked their crystal glasses together, toasting to their own intellect, their own wealth, and their towering iron machines. They were so confident in their artificial heat, so deeply blinded by their academic arrogance and financial supremacy, that they could not feel the subtle, terrifying shift in the atmospheric pressure outside their frosted windows. They did not know that the barometric pressure was plummeting at a record pace. They did not know that the sky to the north was turning a bruised, violent shade of purple. And they certainly did not know that the massive cast-iron boilers they trusted with their lives were completely unprepared for the apocalyptic fury of the White Death that was about to descend upon the town. A storm that would shatter their wealth, freeze their pride, and force them to their knees before the humble wisdom of a 16-year-old girl in a $10 dirt hole. It did not begin with a gentle snowfall. It began with an apocalyptic scream. On the evening of December 14th, the barometric pressure plummeted so violently that the glass lanterns in the town square shattered outward before the wind even truly arrived. Then came the white wall. The cyclonic bomb descended from the high north, dragging the atmospheric temperature down to a staggering, lethal 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind did not just blow, it hunted. It stripped the cedar shingles from the roofs of the town, turning the falling snow into horizontal, blinding shrapnel. It was a weather event that did not merely test human endurance, it actively sought to extinguish it. In the grand, timber-framed estate of Alistair Croft, the illusion of control evaporated in an instant. The massive, cast-iron boilers in the basement, the very machines designed by Julian Arkwright to consume coal and spit out the conquest of nature, began to scream. They were fighting an impossible war against the sheer surface area of the sprawling, above-ground mansion. Arkwright's mathematical models had entirely failed to account for the sheer, brutal reality of thermal bridging. The freezing temperatures did not just seep through the walls. The cold was conducted directly into the heart of the house through the exposed iron framework. 3 miles away, buried beneath the howling crust of the earth, the apocalypse was nothing more than a faint, rhythmic drumming against a pane of glass. Maura sat beside her mother's elevated bed, a cup of hot chamomile tea resting in her scarred hands. The air inside the $9.60 dirt hole was heavy, still, and fragrant with the scent of damp soil and crushed thyme. There were no screaming pipes here. There was no desperate midnight shoveling of toxic coal. The thick, dense earthen walls, having spent the brief winter days quietly absorbing the low-angled solar radiation, were now slowly, patiently exhaling that heat back into the subterranean room. It was a perfect, unwavering 55 degrees. Above ground, the physics of arrogance were violently collapsing. As Croft's boilers roared to maximum capacity in a desperate attempt to superheat the water, the steam rushed up into the freezing iron pipes of the upper floors and instantly flash condensed. The safety valves jammed solidly with ice. Then, the inevitable, unstoppable physics of expanding water took over. With a sound like artillery fire, the expensive cast-iron radiators across Croft's east wing burst wide open. Scalding water spewed across the imported Persian rugs, instantly freezing into a deadly, slick sheet of ice. The heating system was dead. Down in the quiet dark, Maura watched a single drop of condensation slide slowly down the interior of her angled glass roof. The drop fell, landing softly onto the broad, vibrant green leaf of a winter kale plant. The cold sink, that deep trench Arkwright had mocked as a death trap, was working flawlessly. As the air against the glass cooled and grew heavier, it slid silently down the slanted roof, pooled off the edges of the elevated planting beds, and sank harmlessly into the bottom of the deep trench, far below the sleeping bodies of her family. The warm air continued its gentle, passive convection loop. Maura's little brothers slept deeply, their breathing slow and untroubled, completely unaware that the world above them was ending. Panic erupted in the Croft estate. The servants, freezing and terrified, abandoned their posts and fled for the cellar. The coal reserves, stored in an exposed outdoor bin to save interior space, had frozen into a single, impenetrable black glacier. The $350 worth of fuel was completely inaccessible, locked beneath 6 inches of solid, unyielding ice. Croft, wrapped in 3 layers of mink fur, rushed into his prized above-ground glass conservatories, where he kept his highly lucrative exotic cash crops. He arrived just in time to witness the catastrophe. The glass, lacking the massive thermal buffer of the earth to absorb the shock, contracted violently under the -30-degree wind. The entire structure imploded. Thousands of shards of glass rained down, burying his fortunes in a tomb of white snow. In minutes, the exotic plants blackened, shriveled, and died. His wealth was evaporating into the freezing air. Maura gently tucked the woolen blanket tighter around her mother's shoulders. The woman stirred, opened her eyes, and smiled. She did not cough. For the first time in a decade, she felt the deep, penetrating warmth that reached into the marrow of her bones. The warmth of the earth holding her safe. Maura picked up a small, handmade wooden flute and began to play a soft, ancestral melody. The notes floated through the warm, humid air, echoing gently off the earthen walls. It was the sound of humanity in harmony with the planet, a beautiful, humble defiance against the roaring chaos of the surface. By midnight, Julian Arkwright was no longer an engineer. He was a terrified, shivering animal wrapped in a freezing carpet in Croft's parlor. His equations had failed him. His science had frozen solid. Croft was weeping in his ruined study, his inkwells cracked open and frozen, his breath pluming in the dark as the temperature inside the Grand Manor dropped below freezing. The iron machines were dead. The money was worthless. The wealthy men of the town realized with absolute, crushing horror that their gold could not generate a single British thermal unit. They were entirely at the mercy of the nature they had spent their lives trying to enslave, and nature was showing them no mercy. As the frostbite began to nip at their fingers and toes, a terrifying realization dawned on Alistair Croft. There was only one place in the entire territory that was not freezing. There was only one person who had conquered this storm, and she had done it with a rusted shovel and $9. If they wanted to survive the night, the wealthiest men in the city would have to abandon their frozen mansions, walk through the blizzard, and beg for their lives at the edge of a dirt hole. The dawn that followed the Great White Death was blinding, silent, and absolute. The cyclonic bomb had passed, leaving behind a landscape stripped of all motion and mercy. The sun rose over a town that had been transformed into a sprawling, glittering necropolis of ice. The grand timber mansions of the elite, once monuments to capital and industry, now stood as frozen mausoleums. Their shattered windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the massive brick chimneys, choked with the ash of $350 worth of useless coal, were completely dead. Through the waist-deep, powdery snow, two figures stumbled blindly. Alistair Croft, the merchant king, had lost his imported mink coat to the tearing winds of the night. He was wrapped in a rigid, freezing tapestry he had torn from his parlor wall. Beside him, Julian Arkwright, the brilliant engineer of the modern age, dragged his feet, his lips blue, his hands violently trembling. They had abandoned their ruined estate when the indoor temperature dropped below zero. They were no longer masters of the universe. They were fragile, dying animals, reduced to the absolute, humiliating equality of the freezing cold. They marched toward the barren edge of town, driven by a desperate, impossible hope. As they crested the hill, their breath hitching in their frozen lungs, they stopped. There, amidst the unbroken sea of white death, was a perfect, impossible square of melted snow. The angled glass roof of Mora's underground sanctuary had caught the first rays of the morning sun. Because the air inside was a stable, heavy 55 degrees, the residual heat radiating upward had gently warmed the glass, causing the heavy snow to slide off the 39-degree slope. Through the condensation on the panes, Croft and Arkwright could see something that defied all their science, all their wealth, and all their arrogance. They saw vibrant, blooming green leaves. Arkwright fell to his knees in the snow, his academic mind fracturing under the weight of the reality before him. "It violates the laws. It violates the equations," he stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "No fuel, no combustion." Croft dragged himself to the edge of the glass and struck his bruised, freezing knuckles against the reclaimed timber frame. "Please," he croaked, his voice devoid of all its former booming authority. "Please, girl, open the door." A moment later, the heavy, earth-packed wooden hatch swung open. As it did, a thick, visible cloud of steam billowed out into the -30-degree atmosphere. It was a physical wall of life, a blast of warm, humid air carrying the deep, fragrant scent of damp soil, crushed rosemary, and blooming winter kale. To the freezing men, it was the breath of God. Mora stood in the doorway. She was not wearing a heavy coat. She wore a simple, hand-knitted woolen shawl over a cotton dress. Her face was calm, her posture completely devoid of the desperate, shivering panic that consumed the two men kneeling in the snow before her. Behind her, down in the gently illuminated depths of the earth, her mother sat up in bed, sipping hot tea, while her little brothers played peacefully on the warm floor. Croft looked down into the $9.60 dirt hole that he had so mercilessly mocked. He saw the thick thermal mass of the walls, the ingenious cold sink trench, the thriving vegetables that would keep this family fed indefinitely. He saw his own absolute failure. "My crops are dead," Croft whispered, tears spilling from his eyes and instantly freezing on his cheeks. "My boilers burst. The ice has taken everything. I have hundreds of laborers starving in the cold, and I have nothing to feed them. Please, I beg of you, let us in." This was the moment of supreme power. This was the moment where the marginalized could have exacted a cruel, vengeful toll. Mora could have laughed. She could have quoted Arkwright's mocking thermodynamics back to him. She could have left them to the frost. But true wisdom does not seek the destruction of the ignorant. It seeks their elevation. The earth does not exact revenge. It simply provides for those who understand it. "The earth has enough warmth for all of us, Mr. Croft," Mora said softly, stepping aside to let the freezing men descend into the heavy, saving embrace of the underground sanctuary. "But it demands humility before it grants shelter." As Croft and Arkwright huddled near the earthen walls, weeping as the geothermal heat slowly thawed their dying limbs, a profound transfer of power occurred. Croft, a businessman to his core even in defeat, realized that his above-ground agricultural empire was permanently obsolete. He could never again trust iron and coal to fight the winter. The only way to rebuild his fortune, to feed the town, and to guarantee survival in the coming years was to replicate this exact low-tech masterpiece. And only one person owned the intellectual architecture of this survival. Sitting on a wooden stool, wrapped in a blanket, the wealthiest man in the territory looked at the 16-year-old orphan and surrendered. "I will pay you," Croft said, his voice trembling with newfound respect. "I will pay you whatever you ask to design these for my remaining lands. I need food for the town. I need shelters for the livestock. Name your price, Mora. I am at your mercy." Mora did not ask for a lump sum. She understood the mechanics of legacy. She drafted a simple, unbreakable contract on a torn piece of ledger paper. She would act as the chief overseer for the construction of a vast network of Wallapini passive greenhouses across the valley. In exchange, she demanded a 10% royalty on all winter harvests produced within her structures, indefinitely, plus a fixed management fee for every trench dug under her supervision. Croft signed it without hesitation. Arkwright signed as the legal witness, forever abandoning his cast-iron blueprints for the quiet geometry of the soil. In that single, silent morning, the $9.60 dirt hole transformed into a massive engine of passive income. Mora never had to lift a heavy iron spade again. Over the next decade, the valley was transformed. The smoking, roaring boilers of the elite were sold for scrap metal. In their place, hundreds of angled glass roofs dotted the snowy landscape, silently capturing the winter sun, feeding a thriving, wealthy town that had finally learned to stop fighting nature and start cooperating with it. Mora grew up to be one of the most prosperous and respected figures in the territory, not because she hoarded gold, but because she controlled the architecture of life itself. Her family never knew the bite of the cold again. The great illusion of the modern world is that we are superior to the dirt beneath our feet. We are taught to measure our worth by the complexity of our machines and the height of our bank accounts. We build glass towers in the sky and burn the Earth's lungs to keep them warm, mocking the ancient, low-tech wisdom of our ancestors as primitive folklore. But when the sky darkens, when the grid fails, and when the true, terrifying majesty of nature descends upon us, all the money in the world cannot buy a single degree of warmth. True resilience is not found in a catalog of expensive, fragile technology. True wealth is not a number on a ledger. True wealth is knowledge. It is the humility to look down, to understand the physics of the soil, the geometry of the sun, and the massive, silent thermal embrace of the planet that sustains us. Mora conquered the arrogance of the elite because she knew that while men fight for supremacy on the surface, the earth waits patiently below, offering a quiet, invincible salvation to anyone brave enough to dig. If this story resonated with the ancient memory buried in your own bones, do not let it end here. Become a guardian of this knowledge. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your like to help this message break through the algorithms of the superficial world, and share this audio documentary with someone who understands that the old ways are often the only ways. And before you go, tell me in the comments, from which city and country are you planting your own seeds of resistance? This is the Austral legacy. May your hearth be warm, may your roots grow deep, and may you never forget the power of the earth. Until the next storm.